Welcome to the Daily History Chronicle. Each day, we travel back to discover a pivotal moment that changed the world. These aren't just dates and facts. They're stories of courage, conflict, innovation, and consequence that still echo through our lives today. Are you ready to explore? Let's see what happened on this day in history.
This is the Daily History Chronicle, where we explore the moments that shaped our world and discover why they still matter today. I'm Richard Backus, publisher of University Teaching Edition, and every day I get to share a piece of history that I think you'll find as fascinating as I do. Martha Taylor was walking home for supper. She was 72 years old, a net mender, a beaster in local terms, who had spent her entire life in the fishing community of Great Yarmouth on England's eastern coast. Born in 1842, she was the youngest of 7 children, a twin. She and her sister Jane had grown up together on Dog and Duck Row, learning the intricate skill of repairing fishing nets, working long hours for modest pay while the men in their family built and repaired the ships. It was a simple life, an honest one. Her twin sister Jane was waiting at home that evening. It was a cold January night in 1915. The streets dark, the war something that happened far away in the trenches of France. The newspapers carried stories of battles with strange names, Ypres, the Marne, Tannenberg, but those were abstractions. The fighting was over there. The English Channel, as it had for centuries, kept the horror at a comfortable distance. Then came a sound no British civilian had ever heard before. The drone of engines overhead, followed by explosions that turned the night into chaos. When Jane rushed out into the passage to find her sister, she discovered mountains of tile, bricks and rubble, shattered glass, twisted pieces of metal, splintered wood, and through the clearing clouds of dust, she laid eyes on the body of her sister, her twin, her lifelong companion, lying lifeless in the street. On January 19, 1915, the sky itself became a weapon, and nothing about warfare or civilian life would ever be quite the same again. Picture this. It's just after 8:30 in the evening. 2 massive German airships, Zeppelins L3 and L4, have crossed the Norfolk coastline after a 7-hour flight from Hamburg. They were supposed to bomb the industrial ports of Hull and Grimsby, but bad weather and primitive navigation had pushed them south. The crews are numb from the cold, navigating by the light of parachute flares and the glow of coastal towns below. L4's commander, Count Magnus von Platen-Hallermund, is so disoriented he believes he's over Scarborough, nearly 200 miles north of his actual position. The airships are enormous, over 500 feet long, cigar-shaped behemoths filled with highly flammable hydrogen gas, moving through the night at about 40 miles per hour. They carry a payload of 110-pound explosive bombs and incendiary devices, and they are looking for targets. Let me build the clock for you. By January 1915, the First World War was barely 5 months old, but already the Western Front had settled into the grinding stalemate of trench warfare. Both sides sought ways to strike the enemy beyond the battlefield. Germany had spent years developing its Zeppelin fleet, named for Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin, whose company built most of them, and military planners saw these massive airships as a way to bring the war directly to British soil. The Kaiser had authorized the bombing campaign on January 9th, just 10 days before this raid. But there was a peculiar caveat. Wilhelm II initially forbade attacks on London. His concern wasn't military strategy, it was family. The British royal family were his relatives, and he worried a stray bomb might land on Buckingham Palace and kill a cousin. The first targets were industrial and military installations on the coast. The theory was straightforward. destroy British ports and factories, disrupt the flow of supplies to the Western Front, and, perhaps most importantly, terrify the civilian population into demanding peace. There was just one problem. The navigation technology of 1915 made precision bombing essentially impossible. The crews had maps, compasses, and their own eyesight. That was all. They couldn't tell Scarborough from King's Lynn, couldn't distinguish a military installation from a working-class neighborhood. And so, just before 9 p.m., Zeppelin L-3 arrived over Great Yarmouth, a seaside town with no military significance whatsoever, and began dropping bombs on the densely packed streets of St. Peter's Plain. Samuel Alfred Smith was 53 years old, a shoemaker, walking past a row of terraced houses when a bomb struck the building beside him. A flying splinter decapitated him. He became the first British civilian in history to be killed by aerial bombardment. Martha Taylor, returning home for supper, was killed moments later. Windows blew out in all directions. Walls collapsed. The working-class neighborhood, home to fishermen, laborers, and their families, was devastated in minutes. Meanwhile, L4 was heading toward King's Lynn, dropping incendiary bombs on villages along the way. The town's chief constable ordered the street lights extinguished, but he was too late. The glow had already been spotted from above. At 10:50 p.m., bombs began falling on Benning Street. Percy Goat was 14 years old, asleep in his bed. His mother later testified at the inquest. I saw a bomb drop through the skylight and strike the pillow where Percy was lying. I tried to wake him, but he was dead. Then the house fell in. I don't remember anymore. Percy's parents and 4-year-old sister survived. Next door, Alice Maud Gaisley was not so fortunate. She was 26 years old, a war widow. Her husband had been killed on the Western Front just 3 months earlier. When she heard the explosion, she ran outside and was killed instantly. 4 people are dead, 16 injured. In military terms, negligible damage. But what happened that night transcended body counts. Consider this. For centuries, Britain's most significant strategic advantage had been the English Channel, the moat around the castle, an island nation protected by water from the armies that ravaged the European continent. The Spanish Armada, Napoleon's Grande Armée, the Kaiser's ground forces, all stopped by that narrow stretch of sea. In 10 minutes over Norfolk, that advantage evaporated. The borough coroner, Mr. J.T. Waters, called the deaths the wanton killing of harmless people and nothing short of murder. But beyond the moral outrage lay a more profound terror. If German aircraft could reach Great Yarmouth, they could reach anywhere. London, Manchester, Birmingham. No one was safe anymore. The home front had become a front. The public response was extraordinary. In Great Yarmouth, 15-year-old William Gedge was in a bar with his father when the building shook. His father said, "Open the door, boy. There's somebody trying to get into the bar." He had no frame of reference for what was actually happening. Nobody did. The very concept of bombs falling from the sky onto English streets was so foreign that people initially couldn't process it. The funerals were somber, simple affairs. Samuel Smith was buried at Yarmouth's new cemetery. The newspaper accounts described a modest service for a modest man. They were all poor people, these first victims of aerial warfare, a shoemaker, a net mender, a teenage boy, a young widow, no generals, no politicians, no one of consequence in the grand calculations of nations at war. Just ordinary people who happened to be in the wrong place when history changed. Alarmist stories spread that German spies were using car headlights to guide the Zeppelins to their targets. Blackout procedures were hastily implemented, streetlights extinguished, windows covered. The lake in St. James's Park in London was drained so its reflection wouldn't guide bombers toward Buckingham Palace. Recruiting posters used the Zeppelin threat to encourage enlistment. In pubs and music halls, popular songs mocked the baby killer airships, and Britons boasted of their resilience even as they scanned the night sky with new anxiety. But the raids continued. Over the course of the war, 52 Zeppelin attacks would strike England, killing 557 civilians and injuring over 1,300. On September 8, 1915, a single airship hit the Bank of London in the heart of the city. In June 1917, a daylight raid killed 18 children at a school in Poplar, East London, 16 of them just 5 years old. The Germans saw the campaign as legitimate warfare. Captain Hans Fritz, who commanded L3 that January night, filed a routine combat report. Count von Platen-Hallermund's report was more colorful. He described fierce battles against anti-aircraft fire and searchlights over heavily fortified towns. An internal Royal Navy document from 1925 noted dryly, "The firing and the searchlights which the airships reported they had been met with were entirely imaginary." Although the British air stations had been warned at 8:40 p.m., and L4 did not get clear of the Norfolk coast until 12:30 a.m., no anti-aircraft action was taken either by guns or aeroplanes. The Germans, it seems, had imagined the opposition. In reality, Britain was utterly unprepared. But that would change. The raids spurred rapid development in air defense. Fighter planes that could reach the Zeppelin's altitude, explosive and incendiary bullets that could ignite the hydrogen, searchlights, and gun emplacements across the country. By 1916, the Zeppelins were becoming death traps for their crews. The formation of the London Air Defence Area in 1917 led directly to the creation of the Royal Air Force in 1918, the world's first independent air force. And here we arrive at a question worth considering. What happens when a new technology makes the unthinkable routine? Writer D.H. Lawrence witnessed a later Zeppelin raid over London and described the airship as hanging in the night sky, golden like a moon, having taken control of the sky. He wrote that it was like Milton, then there was war in heaven. The stars, he said, were no longer the lesser lights of the night. The Zeppelin had displaced them. H.G. Wells, who had predicted aerial warfare in his fiction years before it happened, observed that the airplane and the airship had fundamentally changed the relationship between civilians and combat. War, he noted, was no longer something that happened to soldiers somewhere else. It had come home. We're still living with the consequences. Every subsequent bombing campaign in history, the Blitz, Dresden, Hiroshima, Vietnam, Baghdad, Aleppo, traces a direct line back to that January night over Norfolk. The doctrine of strategic bombing, the targeting of civilian populations to break enemy morale, the acceptance that wars would be fought not just between armies, but between entire societies. All of it began with those crude 110-pound bombs falling on St. Peter's Plain. Today, the site where Samuel Smith and Martha Taylor died bears a blue plaque. On the 19th of January 1915, this building received a direct hit from a bomb dropped from a Zeppelin airship. Samuel Smith and Martha Taylor were killed. They were the first fatalities in Great Britain caused by an air raid. And Count von Platen-Hallermund, the commander who thought he was bombing Scarborough while destroying homes in King's Lynn, he survived the war. On July 21, 1943, during an Allied air raid on Hamburg, he was killed. The technology he had helped pioneer had come full circle. Winston Churchill, reflecting on the evolution of warfare, once wrote, "The empires of the future are the empires of the mind." Those words capture something essential about what happened on January 19th, 1915. The physical damage was limited: 4 dead, 16 injured, some broken buildings. But the psychological barrier that had been breached could never be rebuilt. The idea that civilians were beyond the reach of war, that the home front was somehow separate from the battlefield. That comfortable fiction died with Martha Taylor and Samuel Smith and Percy Goat and Alice Gasley. And it speaks directly to what we're still grappling with today. Every debate about drone warfare, about cyber attacks on civilian infrastructure, about the ethics of targeting populations rather than armies, every one of those conversations is a continuation of the argument that began when bombs fell on Great Yarmouth. I'm Richard Backus, and this is the Daily History Chronicle. Tomorrow, we'll explore another moment that shaped our world. Until then, consider this. How do societies adapt when technology erases the boundaries between soldier and civilian? What obligations do nations have when new weapons make traditional rules of warfare obsolete? And what might we be normalizing today that future generations will look back on with the same horror we reserve for those first bombs falling through English rooftops? Because that's what the Zeppelin raids teach us, not just about the birth of aerial warfare, but about how quickly the unimaginable becomes merely routine. Thank you for spending these few minutes with me. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe so you don't miss tomorrow's story. And if you have a moment, leaving a rating or a comment means more than you might realize. It helps other history lovers find us, and honestly, I read every single one. If this episode made you think, share it with someone who might appreciate it too. I hope you'll join me again tomorrow for more of our shared history.